Picture Britain in the 1970s. The streets are quieter. The air smells like rain and petrol. And somewhere on a winding country road, a car glides past, long, low, and unmistakably British. The 1970s were a complicated decade for Britain. Strikes, economic pressure, political tension. And yet, somehow, the car industry was producing some of the most beautiful, most ambitious machines it had ever made. These weren't just cars. They were statements, crafted by hand, designed with pride, and driven by people who believed that getting from A to B should feel like something worth remembering. But here's the thing about beauty. It doesn't always last. Today, we're counting down 10 British luxury cars from the 1970s that simply vanished. Some faded quietly, others crashed out dramatically. And number one had millions of fans and still found a way to disappear. Let's begin.
At number 10, we start with a car that was already a legend when the 1970s arrived, the Rover P6 3500. Built by the Rover Company, this car had been turning heads since the late 1960s, but it was in the early 1970s that it truly hit its stride. The P6 3500 carried a 3.5-liter V8 engine that gave it a smooth, confident power. The kind of power that didn't roar. It rumbled, quietly, like it had nothing to prove. Inside, it felt like a gentleman's study on wheels. Leather seats, polished wood trim, instruments laid out with quiet precision. People loved it because it felt serious without feeling cold. It was the car of choice for doctors, lawyers, senior policemen, people who needed reliability but refused to give up elegance. And then Rover moved on. The SD1 arrived in 1976, and the P6 was retired. Just like that, it was gone.
At number 9, now here is a car that deserves to be spoken about slowly. The Jensen Interceptor. Produced by Jensen Motors in West Bromwich, this car was one of the most striking things on British roads during the early 1970s. Its body was designed in Italy. Long, muscular, with a sweeping glass rear that made it look unlike anything else from that era. Underneath was a big American V8 engine, borrowed from Chrysler. So you had British craftsmanship, Italian styling, and American muscle, all in one car. It was bold. It was theatrical. It turned heads everywhere it went. Jensen Motors had big plans, but financial trouble hit hard. The company collapsed in 1976. The Interceptor died with it. There have been revivals since then, but nothing quite like the original. The real Interceptor belongs to the 70s, and the 70s alone.
At number 8, some cars are remembered for what they promised. The Triumph Stag was one of those cars. Launched in 1970 by British Leyland's Triumph division, the Stag was a grand tourer. Open top, long bonnet, beautifully proportioned. It had a unique T-bar roof structure that gave it a sporty, confident look. And with a 3.0-liter V8 engine, it sounded the part too. People fell in love with it immediately. It looked expensive. It looked exciting. It looked like the kind of car you drive along the Riviera with the roof down and not a care in the world. But the engine was unreliable. It overheated, parts were difficult to find. Owners loved the car and cursed the mechanics of it at the same time. By 1977, production ended. The Stag was quietly put to rest, a car full of promise that never quite delivered on it. And yet, people still adore it.
At number 7, Aston Martin in the 1970s was fighting for survival, and somehow they kept producing masterpieces. The AM Vantage, introduced in 1977, was built on the V8 platform that had already made Aston Martin famous. But the Vantage was something different. It had higher output, a more aggressive tune, and a presence that bordered on intimidating. It was hand-built at the Newport Pagnell factory.
Every car was assembled by a small team of craftsmen who knew every bolt, every seam, every surface by memory. Performance was remarkable for its time. People called it Britain's supercar, and they weren't wrong. But Aston Martin in the 1970s was financially fragile. The company changed hands more than once. Production was slow and unpredictable. Some years, only a handful of cars were made. It survived, barely, and the Vantage lived on in spirit. But the raw, handcrafted 1970s version, that era ended quietly, without announcement.
At number 6, some names don't need introduction. But even Rolls-Royce wasn't immune to the turbulence of the 70s. The Silver Shadow 2 arrived in 1977 as a refined update to the original Silver Shadow. And refined is the right word. This was a car that moved through the world as if noise and vibration had simply agreed not to bother it. The 6.75-liter V8 engine was smooth beyond description. The interior was a sanctuary. Thick carpets, hand-stitched leather, genuine walnut wood across every surface. Rolls-Royce built cars for people who had everything and wanted something better. And for a time, the Silver Shadow 2 was exactly that. But 1980 arrived. The Silver Spirit took its place. And with it, a chapter of Rolls-Royce history quietly closed. The Silver Shadow 2 is now a collector's piece. But in the 1970s, it was simply the finest car money could buy. At number 5, not everyone knows this name, but they should. The Daimler Double Six was built in 1972, and it was, in every sense of the word, magnificent. Based on the Jaguar XJ platform, the Double Six was Daimler's flagship. It carried a 5.3-liter V12 engine, 12 cylinders, running so smoothly that journalists at the time struggled to find words for it. One simply wrote, "It whispers." The interior was lined in a quality that made other luxury cars feel ordinary. This was reserved for British aristocracy, senior diplomats, and a very quiet kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. It was large. It was long. It was perfectly silent at motorway speed. But the 70s were unkind to fuel-hungry cars. The oil crisis made V12 engines complicated to justify. Sales slowed. The original Double Six was discontinued, reworked, and eventually absorbed quietly into the Jaguar range. Few cars from that decade felt more like a lost world. At number 4, Lotus has always done things differently. The Lotus Elite, the Type 75, introduced in 1974, was a grand touring car from a company better known for racing, and it showed in the best possible way. It had a fiberglass body that was light and aerodynamic, a 2.0-liter engine that was surprisingly refined, and a shape that looked like something drawn with a single, confident line. Inside, it was more comfortable than any previous Lotus. Wood veneer, proper seats, a sense that Colin Chapman and his team had decided to grow up, just a little. People admired it enormously. It won design awards. It attracted a different kind of buyer. But it was expensive. And in the economic climate of mid-70s Britain, expensive was a difficult sell. Production figures were always low. By the end of the decade, the Elite was replaced by the Eclat and then the Excel. The Type 75, that brief, elegant moment, passed quickly. At number 3, here is a car that almost didn't survive and then became an icon. The Jaguar XJ-S launched in 1975, and it arrived at the worst possible time. Britain was economically battered, fuel was expensive, and the XJ-S replaced the beloved E-Type, a car with a near mythical reputation. Comparisons were brutal. The XJ-S was wider, heavier, more comfortable. It had pillarless side windows and unusual flying buttress rear pillars that divided opinion sharply. Some loved it, many didn't. The 5.3-liter V12 engine drank fuel at a pace that made people nervous in 1975. Early sales were disappointing.
Jaguar's parent company, British Leyland, nearly killed it multiple times. But it survived, and slowly people came around. By the 1980s, the XJ-S had found its audience. By the end of its production run in 1996, it was considered a classic. But that original, troubled 1970s version, before the revisions and the improvements, exists in its own complicated, fascinating category.
At number 2, very few people know Bristol cars, and that was always part of the point. Bristol was never interested in mass production. Based in Filton, the company made cars in tiny numbers for people who actively preferred to avoid attention. The Bristol 412, introduced in 1975, was a large, unusual targa-topped car with a Chrysler V8 engine. It was big, quiet, and deeply eccentric. There was no advertising. There were no showrooms in the conventional sense. You made an appointment. You visited. You either understood Bristol or you didn't. The 412 was built slowly, with extraordinary attention. Every car took a long time to make. The waiting list was long, and the buyers didn't mind because the result was a machine of quiet, stubborn individuality. Production eventually wound down, and Bristol cars drifted into financial difficulty. The company struggled on for decades before finally closing its doors. But the 412 remains one of the strangest, most singular British cars of the entire decade. A car made for people who had found everything else too ordinary. And here we are, number 1. The car that had millions of fans and still found a way to disappear. The British Leyland Princess. Launched in 1975, designed by Harris Mann, this was supposed to be Britain's answer to everything. A family car, a luxury car, a modern car, an optimistic car. And for a moment, it was. The Princess had a shape unlike anything else on British roads. Smooth, flowing, aerodynamic, in a way that felt futuristic for 1975. It had a hydrogas suspension system that gave it a ride quality that genuinely surprised people. It was spacious, it was distinctive. It felt for one hopeful moment like British Leyland had figured it out. People bought it in extraordinary numbers. It became a common sight on every British road. Families loved it. Fleet buyers loved it. It felt like the future. But British Leyland was falling apart from the inside. Quality control was inconsistent. Industrial action disrupted production constantly. Reliability became a national joke. And then there was the structural problem that never fully went away, and the hatchback that never arrived because the tooling costs were too high. In 1982, the Princess was replaced by the Ambassador, and then the Ambassador disappeared too. The Princess had millions of fans, but it became a symbol of what British manufacturing could have been and what it couldn't quite manage to sustain. It is remembered with a particular kind of sadness, not anger, sadness, because it was genuinely good and it deserved better than it got.
10 cars, 10 stories. What they all share is a particular quality that belongs to the 1970s, ambition born in difficult circumstances. These weren't cars made in easy times. They were made in a Britain that was struggling, changing, and trying to hold on to something it was afraid of losing. Craftsmanship, pride, the belief that a car could be more than transportation. Some of these cars failed commercially. Some failed mechanically. Some were simply replaced before their time. But none of them failed in the thing that matters most. They made people feel something. And that is why, 50 years later, we still talk about them. If you enjoyed this journey through British motoring history, like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Which of these 10 would you most want to drive? We'll see you in the next one.